Welcome to Wonder and Words, a conversation series from TCTELA, the Texas Council of Teachers of English Language Arts. I'm Markesha Tisby, TCTELA President and Chair of our 62nd Annual Conference and Exposition. At this conference, we will explore the theme, Welcoming Wonder, Transforming Literacy Education with Inquiry and Imagination. In each episode, I sit down with one of our incredible conference speakers for an honest, unhurried conversation about literacy, learning, and the wonder that brought them to this work. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I'm sitting down with Carole Boston Weatherford, who is so skilled at telling the truth beautifully. I have been looking forward to this conversation, and I think you're going to love it. Let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to jump into our first question, and we are literacy people here at TCTLA. So, of course, our first question is, what are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
I'm going to give you all three. I'm listening to Sade in my head. I am looking at political podcasts like Native Land Podcast and iHip News. I've Had It podcast. Those are all progressive podcasts on which I keep track of the news and particularly, developments that affect Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ plus people who have been marginalized and underserved in the past. And I'm reading the folktale John Henry.
Okay, love that. I love that you hit on all three. And how do you explain what you do for a living to someone who has absolutely no idea?
Well, most people have some familiarity with children's books, and most people know what an author does. But when I was visiting a first grade class years ago, the teacher dismissed the students before had them take a bathroom break before my presentation started. And the first little girl to get back from the bathroom asked me if I was going to be wearing a costume. And I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "I thought Arthur was coming." So I proceeded to draw a picture of Arthur the Aardvark on the board and also a picture of myself. And when the class came in, I explained to them, first I apologized to them if they had been expecting Arthur, the famous Aardvark, rather than me. I was probably then the author of maybe a couple books. And, of course, I told them that an author writes books.
I love that. And as a former first grade teacher and a huge Arthur fan, that just really cracks me up.
Yeah, it's very humbling.
Yes, and children have a way of doing that to us.
They do. They keep
Well,
you honest and humble.
yes, absolutely. And they are honest, always.
Yeah, always.
Now, our conference theme is Welcoming Wonder, Transforming Literacy Education through with Inquiry and Imagination. And so we are really leaning into wonder and just curiosity. So I wanted to ask, what's something like maybe growing up that you were always interested in or that you wondered about, like how things worked or just anything that links to wonder or curiosity?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the 1960s, so there were a lot of space flights at that time. I mean, I can remember when the first man landed on the moon. And one of the early things that I wondered about is if there were aliens, space aliens. And
Yes.
in fact, I thought that there might be life on Mars and that there were Martians, and we had a skylight in our bathroom, and I just knew that if they landed, they were going to come in through my skylight. So I was going to be the first person they'd want to see.
I love the way our brains worked when we were children. Like
Yeah.
everything we could make it make sense, even if it didn't make sense.
Right,
But that was
right.
okay.
I just knew that aliens existed and that I was going to be on their must-see list when they got here.
We're looking for Carole.
Yeah.
Now, in thinking about your work, I love that your father was a printer, and you say you were born with ink in your blood. How did growing up around print shape the way that you see language?
Well, it's not just that my dad was a printer, but when I was growing up, there was always a grandmother in the house.
Mm,
And they were passing down stories, through oral traditions. And they quoted proverbs, they hummed hymns, they made quilts, patchwork quilts out of, old fabric that they had saved, and they were able to associate this piece with a dress and another piece maybe with another dress or somebody's pants. So, there was a storytelling tradition in my family. I had grandfathers, and ancestors who were preachers and the Black preaching tradition was, straight out of, the spoken word tradition.
yes.
But yes, my dad was a printer, and before school, many days, I was at the print shop because my school bus picked me up at my dad's school. So I saw him, setting he showed me how to set type, and I saw, the him ink the type. This is metal type,
Yes.
letter by letter, the letterpress. And I saw, how, words were printed, how my dad used to print little sayings, little proverbs, for his students sometimes to, to motivate them. And I had a toy that was it was called the Big Press, so I had my own little printing press that I played with. So I just was, it just was part of my life. I didn't grow up wanting to be published, but the fact that my dad printed some of my early poems gave me the audacity when I did declare myself a poet and decided that I wanted to be a published author. It gave me the audacity to think that someone else might publish me. And I needed that audacity because I faced a lot of rejection. So I just knew that,
Right.
someone a publisher would eventually accept my work because I had already seen my work in print. My dad had published me.
Oh, I love that. I'm such a word nerd, and then just thinking about how in how him printing your work, you're like, "Yes, well, this is the
Right.
way my
Right.
work is
Yeah.
published. This is just part of
Yeah.
the process."
Yeah, and oddly enough, like I said, I didn't want to be an author when I grew up because I assumed that the books that I so loved to read were written by people who didn't look like me, also by people who were dead, and I had no clue that the people who were writing the books were getting paid to write the books. So I never met a real live author growing up. So it just was beyond even the realm of possibility for me.
Mm,
It was not until I was in college and a young adult that I began going to poetry readings, by poets in the Black arts movement and saw, Antozaki Shange's play for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, that I saw poetry had a home not only on the page, but on
mm.
the stage. And I saw these poets sharing their work, and I started sharing my work publicly in poetry readings. And, then I kinda grew into, being a poet when I had my first professional publication.
Well,
Not a book, but a
mhm.
poem in a magazine, and I wrote for adults first and had poems published in literary journals and poetry chapbooks and even a poetry volume for adults.
That is awesome. I love learning more about your journey because I'm obsessed with your picture books.
Oh, thank you.
But I love learning about your journey and just like your print rich home and just your language rich home. Um, when I think about growing up, it was, I was always looking for stories and I was always hungry for stories. But when I think about you, when you mentioned your grandmothers, my grandmother had a huge, we'll call it a collection of newspapers. They were
Mhm,
everywhere in her home.
mhm.
And when I read through everything in my backpack, I went through those newspapers and I read classifieds, I read horoscopes, I read everything just hungry for print. So when you were talking that, when you mentioned your grandmothers, that's what I thought. I thought, oh,
Yeah,
grandmothers are connected in there and how storytelling is just a part of our history and
yeah.
our
I think it's such a gift to grow up in a multi-generational household. It gives you a sense
absolutely.
not only of story, but of history.
Yes. Yes. There's so much value there. You write often about history's hard truths, like the Tulsa Race Massacre or Magnolia Cox, which I love, for young readers. How do you decide a story is ready to be told and to whom?
Well, first of all, I have to be interested in the story. I like to, approach the, historical events or historical figures that I write about with a sense of awe myself.
Hmm.
So I need to be in awe of, the accomplishment or, what was faced, what was being overcome, and what our people endured. It just, I'm just in awe of, the fact what we've accomplished in the midst of what we've had to endure. So, I have to like the story
Right.
myself first. And then, of course, I want it to be relatable to kids. I don't think that kids are too tender for tough topics, so I don't condescend to them. But I do try to tell the story in a kid-friendly way, but with a lot of emotion, so
Yeah.
they can empathize. They can feel what the people were going through at that time, what the main characters were going through, or what that community was going through in the case of uh, Unspeakable, the Tulsa Race Massacre. So I do choose the details that I want to share, because I want the details to be powerful, but I don't want them to be traumatizing for kids.
Right. Right.
But
And I love that.
I do think that, kids can handle tough topics and that they know how to interrogate injustice. They know the right questions to ask. Like kids will ask after I've shared one of my stories in a school visit, did that really happen? That's often the first question they ask. They just can't believe that,
Hmm.
these things really happened in our country. And then they might say, "Who made that stupid rule?" And then I'll say, "Well, grown-ups, and they may ask, "Why did white people treat black people so unfairly?" And, I'll say, "Greed." And that's the short answer. Um, but they know how to ask the right questions when they are presented with the truth.
Right. And we mentioned earlier that kids are honest, and so they're
Right,
looking
right.
for honesty.
Mhm.
That
Yeah,
makes sense.
grown-ups don't always wanna answer those questions, and, therein lies, um, the the sad truth about book bans.
Mhm.
Grown-ups don't wanna be confronted with the truth.
Right. You said kids aren't too tender for tough topics.
Right. Right.
Mm, I love it. Now, poetry is often seen as intimidating in classrooms. Sometimes it just feels like a challenge or feels like too hard to grasp. What would you say to a teacher who doesn't know how to bring poetry to life for their students?
Well, I could invoke the title of, my book that was a collaboration with my son, Wrap It Up. Um, share poetry just for the sheer joy, of language. Have a poem of the week and, recite it, each day, without any need for analysis. So, I mean, poetry is about, the beauty of language um, and also about, distilling emotion. And so it doesn't always have to be analyzed, but, let it fall on
Mm,
the ears of the students and let them take away what they want to take away. A poem doesn't always have to be a lesson. So I
mm,
think that's one way to instill, the joy, and of course, I mentioned wrap it up. Rap is recognize that rap is a form of poetry and bring that into the classroom as well. Kids love rhyming poetry, particularly the younger they are, the more I think they like rhyme, and of course, the older ones like rap, so they like rhyme too. So don't shy away from rhyming poetry.
okay. Now I have um, a 4-year-old and who is wants to rhyme all day
Oh,
long.
boy.
And so, I'm thinking about him and the way he uses language and how, like, that's fertile ground, right?
That's such a
For
gift, yeah, most definitely, such a
yeah,
gift.
for
I
developing
mean,
a
that's why
love.
The Dr. Seuss books are so popular because they rhyme. Of course, you have to let kids know that not all poetry rhymes. Poetry does not
Mhm.
have to rhyme. Um, so strike a balance and let kids write their own poetry as well. Don't just present, poetry from the canon for them to analyze. I think, more reading, more enjoyment, less analysis will enable kids to really delight in poetry because we have to remember that poetry was originally and still is an oral art form.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so, I mean, because people were illiterate. Balladeers would go from town to town, storytellers would go from town to town, bards would go from town to town, sharing, their spoken word traditions, and poetry was part of that because
Yes.
there were no printing presses.
I think we need to lean into that a little more.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
into that vehicle for poetry. Just be
yeah.
the humans in the work.
Right. There's a competition called Poetry Out Loud. I think you may be aware of it, where kids in high school compete by performing poetry. And they're not poems that the kids write. So they're not original
Mhm.
poems. They're poems, from the canon. Or, kids that I don't know whether a list is given each year, but it's kind of like a spelling bee, but with
With
words.
poetry.
With poetry, yeah. Yeah. And it's not quite a poetry slam, but a little, somewhat similar.
And competition is always nice.
Yeah, and it's national. There's state competitions and national competitions. So,
Okay.
and usually the Poetry Out Loud resource materials are free. So teachers can
Okay.
get those and, use some of those resources in their classrooms.
Love that. Love all those little nuggets. Now, after 80 plus books, what still surprises you about the writing process?
I guess the fact that I still feel the same sense of fulfillment, whenever I finish a manuscript. That, I still enjoy doing it. And I guess that's the case because writing is not what I do, it's who I am.
Mm.
And to feel fully myself, I must write. So it never gets old.
Oh, that's beautiful. Now, we have the pleasure of spending our Friday luncheon at our conference with you. So, for a teacher or an educator who's never used your books in their classroom, what will they walk away knowing or feeling after your session?
Well, I hopefully they'll feel some joy after hearing me share poetry. I do plan to share poetry, and I plan to model how poetry can be shared in the classroom. So there'll be some call and response. I mentioned that I'm the granddaughter of a preacher. I was also a preacher's wife for a while. So I'm a product of the Black church. So we'll be doing some of that. Also, they will perhaps feel more confident in sharing books about tough topics with kids because I want to do some reassuring as far as that's concerned, how to share tough topics and particularly how my books of poetry can fit into that and actually I know this is a conference for English teachers, but how, we can make some connections across the curriculum between ELA, social studies, music, and perhaps even STEM. We'll see.
Well, look at that. I can't wait to be in the room for that. And it sounds amazing. And that's right up our alley while we welcome wonder. Well, I just want to say thank you again for your time. Thank you for your work. Thank you for all of your books. You are such a treat to us in the educator space. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Markesha.
Thank you so much to Carole Boston Weatherford for this conversation. And thank you for listening to Wonder and Words. If this episode moved you, share it with a colleague who needs to hear it. Carole Boston Weatherford will be speaking at the TCTELA 62nd Annual Conference and Exposition during our Friday luncheon. I hope we'll see you there. Registration is open at tctela.org. New episodes drop every other Wednesday. Until next time, keep wondering, keep learning.